Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Towards 2040 conversation series. My name's Amanda Carl, and it's my pleasure to host these conversations with a range of experts talking about themes from the 2040 movie. If you haven't seen 2040, that's fine. Hopefully you will soon. We're just getting into some of the really tricky issues around action on climate change and what we can all do in a really practical sense to move things along. So before we get started on today's conversation, I just want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Yagara and Turrbal land, otherwise known as Brisbane. And I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the fact that this land has never been ceded and we are meeting on Black land, on Aboriginal land. Today we're going to, and that's quite fitting because today we're going to be talking about the land. We're going to be talking about agriculture and different kinds of practices that are reinvigorating our soils and our ecosystems and what that actually looks like. So I'm joined today with two very special guests. So the first, we're going to hear from Mike McCosker, who co-founded an organisation called Carbonate, and we're going to hear about what Carbonate does very soon. But more importantly, Mike's a fourth generation farmer who's really passionate about regenerating soils and ecosystems and also communities as well. So he's going to have a very unique take on this. And Morag works all over the world on permaculture. She trains people in permaculture and runs a permaculture education institute. But more importantly than that, she actually walks the talk and lives the permaculture lifestyle out at Crystal Waters near Mullaney. She's built her own house and lives an off-the-grid lifestyle with her beautiful family, who I've had the pleasure of meeting a few times. So I'm very lucky to have these guys here. We might start with Mike, actually. So not sure how many people who are joining us have actually seen the film. So Mike, maybe we can start by talking about regenerative agriculture, which is a really big theme in the film. So what is regenerative agriculture for people who don't know what it is?
The simplest description is that anything that is rebuilding the soil or rebuilding the ecology of the farm is regenerating that system. So any management practice that is regenerating, we call that regenerative agriculture. So there's a scale within that. You know, somebody that's just started on this journey might only be doing the first thing like retaining their stubble in the paddock. Well, that to them is a regenerative practice. Ultimately, what we're looking to do here is get the ecology of the farm back to a fully healthy basis and the quality of the food coming off that farm as high a quality as we can. That's the aim of regenerative agriculture. And I suppose the pathway within there, once you're in that pathway of repairing the soil, we would now say that you're a regenerative farmer.
Okay, great. So why was it such a big theme in the film? Because the film was really about climate change and what we can do now around that to get to a positive 2040 vision. So why was regen agriculture in the film about climate change?
Unfortunately, agriculture to present date has been a very degenerative process. In fact, there's a large amount of the carbon that's in the air now that actually started out in our soil. And through various management practices that farmers have used, we've degraded the soil over time and released a lot of that carbon out into the atmosphere. In repairing our land, it just so happens that it's the best way to get the carbon out of the atmosphere is to put it back into the soil, and that repairs our soil at the same time. And so it gives us a really open space to talk about this. Some farmers don't believe in climate change, or they talk more about climate variability, but it doesn't matter because they understand that their soil needs carbon in it anyway. So the very pathway of them getting that carbon back into the soil happens to deal with the very concern that people have got about having too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You know, the best place to put it is back in the soil.
So it's kind of the two aspects of it. So there's we've been losing that topsoil, and so that carbon's been escaping into the atmosphere. Is that right? And then so it's kind of a cause of, and then it's also a way to mitigate this by actually drawing back carbon out of the atmosphere through the processes of growing plants?
Yeah. So if you look at a couple of different aspects, if we manage animals poorly, then the animals will degrade the grazing land over time, and we have a process called desertification, which is really the release of a lot of the carbon out of the soil into the atmosphere, and now that land's becoming less and less healthy, less able to hold the water in there that we need to grow the plants, and you know, that process of desertification can be completely reversed simply by changing the way we manage the animals. There's a saying that it's not the cow, it's the how. It's really how we manage those animals that results in whether we're degrading that pasture land or building that pasture land. In farming, as machinery has changed, our process has changed, anything that disturbs that land has an impact. If we are cultivating, then we're taking out the weeds, but we're also disturbing the soil biology, and that can result in the release of some of the carbon. If we're even in a no-till situation and conventional farmers are starting to use chemicals and chemical fertilizers, those practices also upset the soil biology and can result in the release of carbon. It's the way that the management's done that is critical as to whether we're releasing carbon out of that system or we're putting carbon back into the system. And that's the key focus when we're talking to farmers about regenerative practices. We want them to switch from practices that are releasing carbon to practices that are now putting it back into the soil. There's a couple of really huge outcomes here. We know that if we overuse chemicals, that's a problem. We can't build soil carbon while we're using all of those chemicals. So we need to change practices to build carbon. We are also reducing our chemical load. And water holding capacity. Carbon holds water at 4 times its own weight. So for every 1% of carbon we put in the film, it's stated that we can store an extra 166,000 litres per hectare for every rainfall event. Well, that's huge. If we take that land from where some of the conventional farming land is now at under 1%, and we get that back up to our 8% target for carbonate, we're holding a huge amount of water in that land now that's available for plant growth, and our susceptibility to a variable climate, our susceptibility to drought is now much less. Farmers don't get impacted by the weather cycles nearly as badly as we are being impacted now.
Yeah, and I've actually had the pleasure of an amazement of seeing that, where you see one paddock where these practices are being practiced, and right next door you see the paddock that's just completely bare, and you can see the wind, and how that's interacting with a completely different environment that's lush and it's got grasses and trees and all sorts of things. But that diversity there that's keeping the landscape vibrant. So what do you do with Carbonate exactly? What was Carbonate set up to do?
Carbonate was set up because there is the ability now to trade carbon or pay farmers for carbon they're sequestering into their farms, but it's a tremendously difficult process to do. The bureaucracy and the ability of the farmers to get into those programs is very, very limited. I know people that have been working on it for 5 years, and it's only just recently we're starting to get the first couple of trades of carbon that's been sequestered in the soil. So one of the big impediments for farmers getting into this regenerative pathway was how bureaucratic it was. So Carbonate was designed to be as simple as possible. We just want a simple platform that says, here's an incentive for you to change from your current practices to putting carbon back in the soil. And it's an opportunity then for us to share with the farmers all the different new practices. There's a lot of these practices that have only just been getting researched in the last 5 to 10 years. It's only 10 years ago that we could even measure cheaply and easily the biological activity in the soil and get an understanding of what was going on there. So a lot of this is is new information that we're overlaying into the management practices. And we know diversity is hugely important. In fact, one of the pieces of research they did, that you need 6 different species in the mix before you really get successful carbon sequestration. And you can go anywhere from 6 species in the mix up to 18 species and see an increase in the level of carbon going into the soil. So multi-species cover cropping and multi-species pastures are getting a lot more awareness around what's actually happening. The science is coming in behind us now, telling us that, you know, when we get those multi-species pastures together, we're getting a lot more successful carbon sequestration.
Yeah, and so for people who haven't seen the film, that's what. Oh, sorry. Oops, there's a bit of a lag there, I think. Yeah, so that's what the film was focused on, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
sorry about that.
That's right. It's a combination of planting different crops together, and then also using the animals to then come through and eat that, turn that into manure, and let it settle. So and not tilling the soil. So those were the basic principles behind it that you're talking about. Is that right? Just trying to simplify the technical.
That's right. So animal management is really, really important, and that's, you know, it's how the plant interacts with the animals interact with the plants. If we can graze the plant quickly and then give it a rest period, then it rebuilds the plant from the root reserves and it keeps pumping the carbon into the soil. But if we have the animals in the field all the time, of course, what they do is they go through and they eat all the chocolate first, and then they come back and they eat the rougher plants later. And over time, we've changed the composition of that pasture completely. So how we manage the cattle becomes really important as to whether we're degrading that pasture or rebuilding that pasture.
Great. All right, well, we might move on to Morag and then come back and open it up to a bit more of a discussion. So Morag, yep, you're off mute, great. So you run the Permaculture Education Institute. What's permaculture? Like, it's a term everyone's familiar with, but what actually is it? What are the main principles behind it?
Well, essentially, permaculture is about design, and it's about designing for a one planet life. And it's looking at how we design our food systems. It's looking at how we design our human habitats. So how do we live in a way that enables us to live a one planet life? And that includes how we live in our cities, in our towns, our villages, and on the farm. And so it's it's a very broad concept, and in a way it's an ethical framework to make decisions. It originated out of agriculture, so permanent agriculture, but has evolved over the 45 years that it's been going to really look at our cultures as a whole and how we can shift our mindscape, I think. Something that Charles Massey was talking about the other day, about how in order to change our landscapes, we need to change our mindscape. And so it is about looking at what actually do we see is food. You know, this is one of the big things that I think is starting to come really forward, particularly with the IPCC report that came out just the other day, looking at really the impacts of our food system and the problems that we're facing right now. And it is about getting the carbon in the soil, is what Mike was saying. But I think it's also a really big shift about how we think about food and food waste and creating cycles and integrating people with their food system again. Because for me, I think what we've lost is the connection. We've lost the connection with the soil. We've lost the connection with between the urban and rural communities. We've lost our understanding really about what is food. We've got to the point now where I think, 3 species of plants feed 60% of what we eat. That's rice, wheat, and maize. There's so many different types of plants that are edible, and there's part of this too is about food waste. And the further we are, the distance between the farmer and the consumer, the more waste there is. And so permaculture is a lot about restoring local economies, creating connections between local farmers and local communities, getting people to understand the food system and start to grow more, to support local farmers farmers in the region from the urban communities, and there's some really amazing examples that have been set up. I mean, one example that I came across in Korea actually, where it's a community-supported agriculture system, and so there's this small-scale farm in a village that's being restored into a sort of an ecological village area, and they were posting their eggs to their urban consumers. I don't know if we could quite do that in Australia, but this idea of actually. So there's a local farmer who wants to create a regenerative, local, small-scale food system that has a multiplicity of species that are engaged in it. And how do you create markets that take us out of the market system that engages us with all of the things which are undermining our sustainable food systems, all the subsidies and the taxes and the trade agreements and all the things which undermined our local food system and our earth-based agriculture. And so finding that, Food Connect in Brisbane, for example, a brilliant example of how to connect local farmers with urban communities. So a lot of permaculture is about that education, and it's about how to grow food. It's about diversification. It's about building soil carbon. It's about improving what we think about food. One little example that I've got is my little pumpkin example. So when we look at pumpkins, we look at this as being the food, but actually the whole entire plant is edible. So one of my main sources of greens is the pumpkin greens. And so you can eat the shoots, the leaves, and the flowers, the seeds, the skin, everything. So when you look at a pumpkin plant, the only thing that gets to the stores is this. But if you're growing pumpkins, actually there's a massive amount of food that's available. And so you actually think the food waste that happens that we talk about, that we map, is the food waste that comes in terms of the pumpkin, but I'm looking at actually the whole system food waste. And I think actually we probably throw away maybe almost up to 90% of our food if you think about all the bits that we don't eat, that we don't think is food. And when you walk through a garden, like a permaculture garden, and sometimes you can think, oh, where is the food? But it's the tree crops, it's the seed crops, it's the parts of the plants that we don't tend to think of as food. So in terms of that, a lot of the research I've done has been talking to villagers, to women in various communities, to try and understand what actually is food. What are the things that we can eat? What are the resilient foods? What are the foods that don't require massive amount of fertilizers or chemicals to maintain them? Things that, if we have a dry time, they're going to keep on going. And I've just been away for about 6 months all up without being able to spend much time in my garden, and coming back and seeing, it's interesting, without watering, without weeding, without doing anything in this polycultural garden, to notice what are the things that have survived and flourished actually. And so it's really looking at creating, how can we create a thriving abundance of food in and around our cities and our schools and our homes that can enable us to diminish our impact on the broader system, to bring our footprint into the smallest possible space so that we can return much of the other space back to nature. Because our footprint on the planet, as we know, is way higher than it's possible. I mean, if everyone lived like a typical Australian, we'd need 4 Earths. And our ecological footprint, our overshoot day for this year was globally was July 31st, but in Australia it was March the 31st. So within 90 days. Within 90 days of this year, we've actually overshot our budget. So food, and what we think of food, and how we can actually think about using all parts of the food, returning food back into our cities and our schools and our workplaces, and making decisions differently about how we eat. So it's this idea of creating a sustainable or regenerative diet. And that includes supporting the regenerative farmers and being really clear that that's, it means shifting, it means change. People don't like change, but I think that's actually what we need to do now. And it's become very clear with the reports that are coming out that that we don't really have an option terribly much now.
No, we don't. So, okay, so we're actually doing a whole session on food in a couple of weeks' time, so that's a good intro into that around what we need to do around the food systems. But so some of the things I've heard from you both, so it's improving soil carbon. It's about increasing diversity in the practices. It's about organic, so moving away from chemical processes. What are some of the other principles around, that are shared? Because there's permaculture kind of approaches. What are some of the principles around that? But there's other approaches as well, aren't there? There's an organics movement, there's the agroforestry movement, but they all share quite similar principles. What are some of the other principles that we should be aiming for in approaches to farming? Morag?
Well, I think that the key things that you mentioned there about getting carbon into, like bringing the soil alive, thinking about feeding the soil, creating that thriving ecological system, and recognizing that the soil is probably one of the most diverse places on the planet, and building soil life as well as soil carbon. That's absolutely critical. So the diversity underneath the soil replicated on top, getting into multi-species. So soil, getting the water.
So it's like composting, and what else? Like how do we do that?
I mean, the key thing is adding organic matter into the soil. So feeding the soil organic matter. So that is composting and chop and drop, and leaving the stubble in the soil, no-till methods. All of those things contribute, and the scale changes. So whether you're out in the broad scale fields or pasture lands, or if you're in a backyard, those same principles apply. And by doing that, then we're able to get more moisture, as Mike was saying, absorbed into the soil. Our best place to have the water is stored as like a sponge in the soil, and then our plants are able to be far more robust and resilient, support much more life. So the soil and the water are key, and so composting and as much no-till and diversification is critical. I think, if we could get those things right, that would make such a difference at every scale.
And then that kind of taking that systems approach in the design around, inputs and outputs, and actually turning that into a circular kind of process rather than the linear agricultural
model.
Another
really key thing is thinking about the types of plants that we're growing. So I mentioned, that there's three plants that we rely on most, but there's so much diversity. So we've actually lost, I think the FAO is talking about, 75% at least of our plant diversity, our food plant diversity has been lost since the Green Revolution began. And so part of what Vandana Shiva talks about, and many others like her, is to say that we actually need to return back our indigenous seeds, the seeds that that belong in those places. So we can kind of rebuild that, but I think the best thing is to actually save the ones that are there now and start to spread those out as wide as possible, because it's those plants that have the resilience to the dry zones, to they belong in that particular soil, in that particular climate. They are far less prone to pests. Like, I've just recently come back from Uganda and Kenya, and some of the women's groups that I was working with, I'd go and I'd say, well, what are the issues that you're facing? And they were talking about pests and water and soil were their key things. And so I asked them, so what are you trying to grow? And they were saying cabbages, carrots. This is in the tropics. So why is that? It's because of, colonization. It's because of globalization. It's because of all of those different forces that have been placed on there. And it's an attitudinal shift that the types of traditional foods that were grown in those places are not valued. So they would walk past indigenous foods because it's seen as backward and primitive. And so we need to actually kind of revalue a lot of those traditional foods, and also revalue farming. I mean, one of the things also that I came across a lot there, particularly with the younger people, I would say, oh, so what are you wanting to do? And they would say, oh, I'd like to be, the boys would all say they'd like to be an engineer, and the girls all said they wanted to be corporate lawyers. And if you mention anything about farming, this is in the middle of a village where there's no power, there's no water, nothing. And so and if you talk, I was talking to the teachers too, and I said, so they said the young people see the farming as a punishment. And actually the teachers issue farming as a punishment. They say, if you don't do your work, I'm going to send you out to dig in the school farm. And so there's this cultural, psychological attachment that we have that farming is something that is not valued. And I think, I work a lot with young people, even here in Australia, in the urban environments and the peri-urban environments, and I bring them out on camps and we expose them to a whole lot of regenerative food systems, and I ask them, so how many of you are interested in becoming a farmer? And I swear one person has put their hand up in the last 25 years that I've been doing this. And I find that really disturbing. And I actually find it really encouraging. After we start to explore it a bit more, they open their mind about what is farming, what is food systems, and what are the possibilities. And I think there's a massive shift that needs to happen in our education, because most schools actually don't have agriculture or a really holistic approach to agriculture. And it's something that's out there, it's a very disconnect. We're very disconnected from our food system. I think, this is one of the key things that we need, is to build the relationships, to strongly forge those connections. Because also, the stories that we hear is that a lot of farmers are actually really struggling, and particularly from that lack of disconnection and lack of value and lack of support. And, I'm sure Mike can talk about that far more eloquently than I can. I hear more of the stories of it. So connection and relationship and value, and I think those are, we need to think broader than, it's a cultural shift. We need to bring the culture back into agriculture. We need to really focus not just on the practical side, but it's the economic side, it's the government side, it's the psychological, it's a whole systems approach to this issue, I think, is required to address the changes that we need to make.
Yeah, great. So, okay, so I'm just keeping an eye on time because I really want to get to the questions, because there's a lot of questions from participants. Mike, I wanted to throw to you.
So, thanks, Morag. I mean, what you say is excellent, and how you say it is very beautiful. There is one of the reasons why we put Carbonate together was to try and help hook together the people in the cities with the farmers. It's a simple platform that says, give up a couple of cups of coffee a month, and we'll help farmers switch to regenerative practices. But there's actually a bit more behind it than that, because when you sign up, we also sign you up to the Regenerate magazine, and that gives us the ability to talk to you about what you can do in your everyday shopping habits and everyday lives to really help support farmers, because farmers are very resilient, and they are also very innovative. And they will follow the price signals that we give them. So if we start to be really careful about where we're putting our food dollars, and really ask where that food's come from and how is that food being grown, that is just so important. There's a group that we work with in the States called the Bionutrient Association, and they've done some work on the food quality, the nutrition that's coming out of different farming systems. Now, when they looked at carrots, for example, there was a 20,000% difference between the worst carrot they tested and the best carrot they tested. And if you put the worst carrot at 0 and the best carrot at 100, most of what we see in the supermarkets sits between 6 and 16. Most of the food that we get in the supermarkets at the moment is rubbish. We need to ask where it's come from and how was it grown. And if we deliberately ask, at the moment, our avenues for doing this insist on organic and or buy at the farmers markets, where you can develop that direct relationship with the farmer, and you can ask them what are your growing systems? How are you growing that carrot? If we think about that, if we had a carrot that's sitting at 20, you've got to eat 5 times the number of carrots as if you're eating a carrot that's sitting at 100. So from the point of view of our ecological footprint, we've our ecological footprint's just gone up by 5 times to get the same amount of nutrition into our diet. So how the food is grown is just so critically important, and that's why we've got to get farmers back onto this pathway of rebuilding their soil and get the carbon back in the soil. It's got so many benefits for us globally and ecologically, but it's also got this huge impact on the quality of the food that's coming out of those farming systems, and then ultimately our health, because we consume that food. And we either consume really nutrient dense food, great quality food, or we consume food that's down at that 6 or 16 end of the scale, and it's probably got chemicals in it, because now we need a whole heap of chemicals in there to keep the bugs out of it while we're trying to get it to the marketplace. You know, when we've got the carbon back in the soil and we're now producing that better quality food, we're also doing it without the need for chemicals anyway, because the natural resistance of nature is now healthy. We don't have the insects. You know, one of the ways that insects are designed to take out the garbage.
Yeah.
So if we have food that is high in nutrition, it doesn't even attract insects. You know, that we don't even have those problems. We don't have insect problems, and we don't have disease problems in the food that is of a high nutrient content. The way that nature gets that nutrient content balanced is by having a polyculture. Different plants run different biology around their roots, but that biology shares between all the plants down there. You know, we're finding now these fungal networks that operate underneath the soil. We can't see them, but all the plants are talking to each other. And one plant might be really good at getting zinc out of the soil, and another plant's really good at getting copper out of the soil. And, you know, so they now share, because that plant that's getting the copper, he can get more than he needs, gives it to the one that's getting the zinc, and they trade back for, you know, so it's all going on underneath the soil. We've just got to help nature rebuild itself, get out of the way, stop disturbing it, stop spraying chemicals on it, and it'll get back to the point that, you know, that it is giving us good quality food in a way that we don't need the chemicals to keep rescuing it to get it to the shelf.
Yeah, great. I just want to start moving on to the questions that people have. But before we do that, I guess I want to get into, because you've both talked about some things, but I know that there's so many different experiments happening around the world right now based on the principles that you're talking about to shift farming practices. And we know we have to do this, and we're getting a lot of feedback. Climate change is just one of the feedback loops that's sending us warning signs that we need to change the way we do this. And I think most farmers know it as well. When you talk to them, they know that things have to change. So what's holding back that change? What's stopping farmers from being able to do it? So we've already talked to Mike about the fact that some of the financial incentives, they're kind of there, but it's actually really hard and bureaucratic to make that happen. But what are some other barriers to stopping farmers from doing things differently, either at an individual level or a systems level?
Yeah, I think people making different decisions in the grocery stores is actually one of the most powerful things that we can do. If everyone had one of these nutrient density meters and we could tell which was the 16 carat and which was the 6, and we left the 6 on the shelf, well, the guy that was producing the 6 would have to change. Otherwise we'd be out of business very quickly. But at least if we can know that, you know, we go in and we say that, well, I'm only going to buy an organic carrot, you know, because I don't trust the way that the farmers are growing it otherwise. Or I go to the, you know, we get a regenerative certification happening, and there's a few of those systems coming out now where we can say, okay, well, we know that this is a regenerative farmer, so I'm going to buy my food from you. I'm not going to buy it from somebody. I'm not going to go and buy a bag of carrots that says Woolworths carrots, because that doesn't tell me where they came from. I want to know who grew it and what method they used to grow it. That will get the signal back to the farmers. That price signal is critical to getting change. Then it's just really some of the knowledge base within the farmers. If the farmers are looking for that knowledge base, they'll find us anyway and find out how to do it. Methods like crimp rolling, you know, where you can just grow a multi-species cover crop, run the crimp roller across it, and now we've got inbuilt mulch, beautiful weed protection mat. We direct drill into that mulch and we can grow our crop in a way that hasn't disturbed the soil. We've got all of that soil biology there, still there, working for us on that new crop that we're trying to grow, getting all the nutrition into that new crop. That's a completely different way of farming to what most of the farmers are doing now, where they're either tilling to control weeds or they're spraying to control weeds, and they're setting up this bare fallow, this sort of mini desert between crops with nothing growing there, and then they expect the crop to grow this beautiful nutrient dense food. Well, it doesn't happen. We need that diversity in the system to get that to happen. So some of that will be a change of equipment. We'll need to go, sell the spray rig and buy the crimp roller. So there's some of that stuff that will take a little bit of time to change, but it won't change unless the price signals change, unless we get to the point that we can't sell the chemical carrot anymore and the farmer has to change his system. So, I think it's an interaction between the food consumers and then anything that we can do at the farmer end just to help educate the farmer about what different systems are available to do this.
Yep. Murray, what are your thoughts on what's sort of blocking things and what needs to change, or how we can help it to change?
I think, I echo a lot of what Mike says, and, a lot of my work has been upon, on the education or on the consumer end and actually raising awareness. And I think the more that we can do that and shift that. So, a lot of programs, there's free education programs that the city councils are rolling out. There's, sponsoring ways that this information can get into schools, into community centres, supporting things like community-supported agriculture, community gardens, city farms, all of those sorts of things. Because what that happens, when those things start to take place, people start to have the conversations about this issue, and they start to find other people who care about it. They start to feel like they're not alone in worrying about this issue. They open up the dialogue about, well, I'd like to buy that food, but where do I get it in my neighbourhood? And if it's not available, then as that group, they start to generate new alternatives to the Coles and Woolies, and it's when
like
those
food buying co-ops or things like that.
like sort of farmers markets, food co-ops, community supported agriculture systems, and those sorts of things start to ripple out. But until people start to feel connected and enabled and I don't know, in a way given permission, I don't know why it is that we feel like until there's a collective of people who say that, it's sort of, I think we've got past the point now, maybe, well, I hope that it's seen as an edgy fringe type of thing to be talking about and to be doing, because it seems to be the most highest priority that we have at this point in time is to shift the way that we eat and to shift the way that food is grown. And so and as Mike's saying, until there's a shift in the consumer side, it's going to be challenging for the farmers to be able to make that shift as well. So my role mostly that I've been working on, and that I really think is really important, is to get as many people to be learning about regenerative farming and permaculture, and getting as many teachers to ripple that out. And for everyone who understands it, to open up conversations, whether it be in your work or in your school or your organisation, and that wherever your sphere of influence is, that you start to talk about this and that you speak up about it, and that if there's an opportunity to make a decision to choose differently, that you take that choice and you lead that way and if you start to understand this, to become a leader and be courageous and make those different decisions, because it's too easy just to keep on going on the way it is. But if we do, we just we've got to the point where we can't keep on doing it the way that it's been done all that time. Yeah. So I encourage everyone to become more aware, to join in on this conversation, and to become leaders. We're kind of setting up a new program. There's an international group of people looking at climate change and permaculture. One of our strategies is to actually create permaculture ambassadors, people who go out into the community and start to talk about this more and raise awareness about it, and in a full spectrum of regenerative agriculture and community-based solutions.
Great. I want to add to what you both said, because I'm a big believer in systems change, and unfortunately I think we need to start with individual action, absolutely, and people's sphere of influence, but there are also other forces at work, that it's not just consumer choice. So even if it's thinking about the big supermarket chains and engaging with them around what food that they're buying as well, because they're also business model is responsive to pressure. So there's that level, and there's the policy work, which is probably beyond most people. But also how you support, like try and buy that local food and support local farmers. And there's a couple of organisations out there that are doing that work. I'm going to jump to questions from people as opposed to just my questions. So the first one sort of speaks to the fact that we're talking about agriculture, but when we're talking about climate change, it's actually broader than just agricultural practices. And it's from Alice Bradshaw, and she was talking about how she caught a train recently and she was looking at all the treeless paddocks. So she'd like to hear your thoughts on convincing farmers to dedicate portions of their paddocks to growing trees and turning this into profitability. So how do we do that? What mechanisms are in place to help support tree planting? Who wants to go? Mike?
There are a number of different programs that support tree planting. Landcare is one program that's very well known and over the years has had a tremendous impact, and it's been a very grassroots movement. It was the farmers themselves getting organised and together in these landcare groups that has done a lot of work. The reality is that the first 10% of tree cover on the property actually improves the productive capacity of the property. You can go from anywhere from 10% tree cover up to 30% tree cover before you actually start to decline again in productivity. So when you look at it just purely from an economics perspective, we can have 20 to 30% of tree cover on our land, and that is the most productive balance for that land. So we also know that tree cover is now healthy if we're up around that 30% tree cover, because that's now a self-sustaining ecology as well. So if we look at the whole ecology of the farm, I think that's important. That's where I love permaculture. Permaculture looks at the whole ecology and it looks at the systems working within that farm. So we're doing whatever we can to bring a permaculture mindset essentially to across all of agriculture, and holistic management is another tool that is maybe a little bit better known in the larger farmscape, but that's really a decision-making model that helps you choose whether how you're going to manage those different systems of ecology on the farm. It gives you a lot better way of making decisions that have impact on the ecology instead of just making it from a dollar perspective. So anything that we can do to help people understand that and see the research, do that research, we know that we can have 30% tree cover and still be making money. Over the 20 years I've been involved in regenerative agriculture and biological agriculture, farming that way is actually more profitable anyway for the farmer. So it makes me wonder why at this stage we aren't all biological and regenerative farmers. Maybe there's been an information feedback loop that hasn't been working, or it's been hijacked a little bit by industrial agriculture.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean it's not just that farmers learn from themselves and they just do their own thing. There are systems set up to extension services, so you sort of your traditional DPI, Department of Primary Industry training, and then the sorts of equipment and chemicals and support that is offered can be sponsored by large companies as well. So there are other forces at work that are sort of also have over time set things up the way they are, and then it gets very expensive to shift that. Like you said, there's equipment, and it's scary, especially if people are vulnerable. And you're dealing with the average age of a farmer is what now, 60 something. So there's a whole lot of factors that make that sort of challenge that make it difficult. But getting back to the tree planting question, there are programs in place to encourage tree planting. So there's land care. Do you guys, is that part of Carbonate that you actually support, one of the practices that you support farmers to increase their tree coverage?
Yeah, one of the things that we will be doing is hooking the farmers up with a regenerative agronomist. So, and then we'll be looking for them to give us their farm plan for regeneration, and then that way our technical committee can look at that. If we can help with any sort of education information flow across to the farmer about different ways they could move into regenerative practice. And then we can also just sign off on that, so that we know that when we're supporting them, that money's going towards regenerative practice. So that direct relationship between a regenerative agronomist and the farmer is important for us. And then that farm plan, that regenerative plan for the farm becomes important for us as well, because that starts to give us, clarity about where the money is being spent.
Right.
I think
And
it's
there's
really
also,
important.
And that plan may very well include tree planting or just whatever is needed to get the ecology of that farm back to a healthier place. Yeah.
all right.
I was just going to say, I think that the point about the type of advice that's being given too is really important. I was hearing you saying about the type, linking up advisors to farmers is really important. You're talking about DPI. I'm thinking about in places like Africa when people come into those villages and tell them that they should be using these seeds and these chemicals, and that's the advice, the most modern advice that they're being given, and they believe it because it's come from science. And so it's about rethinking the type of advice, but it's also and supporting better advice. And it's also rethinking the sort of industrial model of separating everything from having, the farms over there, nature's over there, and people are over here. It's about how can you bring all those things back together so that, the people, farm, and nature are integrated together in an ecological system. And I see that here in the eco village where I live, where we have 640 acres. There's 250 people living here. About half of the land is regenerated for forest and for riparian zones, and the mid zones is where the agriculture happens. And so it's a combination. It's bringing people back into the landscape in villages and actually developing different types of human habitats in our landscape rather than just having all in the cities and scattered farm communities. I think we need to think differently about that sort of industrial model of separate planning too.
Yeah, cool. I think this should be a fairly quick question to answer. Sorry, I've got lots of questions, so I'm going to start pushing them onto you. So hopefully it's a quick question. So one of the challenges is we're looking at population increases of up to 9 billion by 2050 with the same amount of resources that we have today. So can we have a food industry based on regenerative farming to be able to feed all of those people without significantly increasing the cost of food, although they admit that the cost of food is too cheap at the moment? So can we feed the world with regenerative / permaculture approaches to farming?
I would say yes. I would say yes, a very big yes, because nature's abundance is quite amazing when we work with nature. And going back to that discussion around the carrots, where most of the carrots in the supermarket are sitting between 6 and 16 on the scale. Well, if we improve the quality of those carrots, and now we're eating carrots that are sitting up at 80 and 90 on the scale, then we've decreased our impact by 100%. We need 1/5 the amount of food to get the same nutrition that we're currently trying to eat now. So to me, the regenerative practice is critical to get the nutrition back in the food, and then we don't need as much food to sustain our own bodies anyway.
Yeah, great.
And a lot of the traditional types of wheat had 10 times as much nutrient as the current ones now. And like I was talking about too before, that if we actually understand how to eat more of the plants and have more food landscapes, edible landscapes around us everywhere, I think we can transform things quite much as well.
Yeah, because it's often the transportation of food and the way it's stored and ripened artificially that actually also reduces the nutrient content as well, isn't it? Okay, another one. So there's a very long question, so I'm going to shorten it. From a stud beef producer who was also a co-founder of a climate action group, and she's been thinking a lot about, this is from Jill Coughlin, so she's been thinking a lot about managing climate change, and So is the UN accurate in suggesting reducing red meat consumption rather than addressing the benefits of carbon farming? So she's sort of saying, is it about reducing meat consumption, or is it about increasing carbon farming?
I think it's important from a global impact perspective that we all look at our consumption. I think that is a really big issue, particularly from a waste perspective. And food waste is a big aspect of that, as well as all the other waste issues that we deal with, like plastic. And so I think our need to consume needs to be moderated anyway. But at the same time, we do need to focus on getting this carbon back in the soil and the regenerative practices, because that is what will make the food the highest quality that we can get, which means that we don't need as much land devoted now to agriculture to produce the nutrition that we need. So, I think it's a combination of both.
All right, did you have anything to add? Or
just in terms of thinking about the types of ways that the meat is produced. If it's in a regenerative farm environment, it's very different from the types of farming that we see, in America, and from clearing of forests and the growing of the massive monocultures. Like, what was it? 96% of the soy grown in what was Brazilian rainforest is actually fed to the cattle. So it's thinking differently about how the meat is grown, and where it comes from, and actually diminishing the amount of meat that we do consume, because what they're saying recently, some of the figures that perhaps in America that we're eating 5 or 6 times as much as the meat that's actually required for our healthy nutrition. So it's about putting things back into balance and putting things back into a system that has ecological integrity.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and that goes back to the population question as well, because what is it? It's about, so half of the food grown, actually, was it 45% of the food grown goes to feed animals, and then of the around the 50% that goes to us, half of that ends up as food waste, doesn't actually even end up with us eating it. So that goes back to the population question again. It's about how we produce the food, and the systems around it, and having more localized systems will actually mean, and having better systems means it's more nutritious, it gets to us in better quality, there's a lot less waste, and we're actually feeding many, many more people better quality food. Last question I've got here is, I've heard that there's a resource, What to Plant Where. What to Plant Where looks like the title of it. Do you know about this and where to find it? I'm looking at a small scale urban permaculture garden or small holding. So this is from Ria Ford. She's looking for where can she find information about what to plant and how to plant it. Do you have actually any links, any organisations, any websites that you find interesting apart from your own work? Because we'll actually put a list of resources and links together with the recording after the webinar.
I really like looking at some of those websites that are connected to the non-hybrid seed suppliers. So people like Eden Seeds, Green Harvest, Digger Seeds, because they really focus in on the diversity of seeds and have information that's available across Australia about where those types of seeds, what type of seeds are viable in different areas and when they can be grown. So I'd be directing people to those resources, and particularly to try and actually access your seeds from them as well, or local permaculture groups and seed saving groups that we can start to build up our seed network again. It's one of the most important things I think we can do is to rebuild our seed sovereignty. There's some horrendous figures. I can't even remember exactly how much it is, but I think there's something like 3 corporations that own half of the seed in the world, and then determine, the chemicals and they can't be saved. There's so many different issues that are attached to that, and we don't have time to go into it all now. So I would encourage people not to buy seeds from the big hardware stores or any of those sorts of places, but go directly to local seed companies, local ethical seed companies or community seed banks, and to start saving seeds and setting up your own community seed libraries and creating local planting guides as well, because it's really different. I actually, here in the subtropics, one of the things that I do is I don't use a guide. I read the garden landscape. So when I see something starting to self-seed, because one of the best places for actually storing your seed in a garden environment is actually in the soil. So I notice when the mustard greens start to come up, I know it's time to start planting the things of that family. When I see the pumpkin seeds starting to come up, I know it's time to start planting that family. So reading the landscape and working, because things change, it's not exactly on that date or exactly that time. Climate's all over the place. So being able to really start to connect up with local people and read your own local landscape and set up your local systems is good. But to get you started, those other places that I mentioned earlier, I think would be a really good place.
Mike?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think the heritage seed places are really important. One of the aspects of commercial agriculture that people don't think about is that over the years, as we've bred new varieties, we've actually selected varieties that now grow in this chemical agriculture system. And a lot of those varieties don't have the same mycorrhizal association within the roots, so they don't have the same ability to harvest the trace nutrients out of the soil. And again, it comes back to this level of nutrition that's in the food. So a lot of the modern varieties are not as healthy for us as some of those heritage varieties. So I think they're a great resource, and try and grow as many different types of carrots, for example, in your garden as you can. Have your traditional orange carrots, but also have purple carrots there, and just try it. It's amazing, and it becomes fun with the kids too, because they sort of go, hold on, that looks like a carrot, but it's not the right color, Mum. What have you done? So I think they're a great resource. The other thing I was going to say, from a systems change perspective, I think in our research, our agricultural research, even at a national level, we need to get back to some independent research, because I think it was back in about the 1970s that the government defunded the research, and now the only research that gets done is something that's funded by a commercial company. So of course that is only going to look at issues that will benefit those commercial companies. We need to get on to the government guys and go, hey, hold on, we need some decent research money back in here, so we can look at varietal changes, look at systems changes now that don't necessarily have commercial outcomes, but have tremendous ecological outcomes and tremendous nutritional outcomes.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
fantastic. We're just about out of time. We covered a whole lot of ground there, excuse the pun. So that was really fantastic. Thank you both, Morag and Mike, for joining us. For everybody else, we're going to post some links after the recording. The recording usually goes up tomorrow, and I really encourage you to share the recording of this conversation, but also the previous ones we've done. Talking about climate change was the first one, and energy democracy was the second one, because people are wanting this information. And we've got a change of schedule. So instead of in a fortnight's time, our next conversation is next Sunday. And we're going to be talking about the systems level stuff, because it keeps coming up in the chat. So we're going to be talking about power and politics, and how do we engage as citizens, and what do we do when our politicians aren't listening to us. So that's going to be a really fun chat. And we're going to be joined by Tim Hollow and Nicola Paris for that one. So please register. The registration should go up maybe tomorrow. Actually, no. I think Anna, who's helping us out, will post the link in the chat box now, so you can register straight away, and then we'll be promoting it during the week. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at the next conversation. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.